There's something that lit up the internet these past few days, and it wasn't a scandal. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't even a spectacular performance in the traditional sense of the word. It was a moment. A moment that, for some people, felt beautiful, intimate, almost healing. And for others, just someone putting on YouTube and singing over it. Regardless of whether you're a fan of Justin Bieber or not, whether you grew up with his music or not, I think there's a much deeper conversation worth having here. What actually happened on that stage? Why are some people crying while others are calling it mediocre? Are we just talking about nostalgia, or is there something more complex going on? And maybe the most important question of all, what does it mean to make peace with your past in public? Welcome. This is Conscious Conversations. And today, we're not just talking about Justin Bieber. We're talking about something much more uncomfortable, much more human, and probably much closer to home than it seems. There are moments in pop culture that aren't important because they were perfect, but precisely because they weren't. Or rather, because they weren't trying to be. Because they weren't built to dazzle you with fireworks, with impossible staging, with perfectly choreographed movement, or with a technical display of, look at everything I can do. Sometimes, the moments that stay with you the most are the ones that feel a little fragile, the ones that carry a bit of a wound, the ones that feel less like a show and more like a conversation, less like a coronation and more like a reunion. And I think that's what this was for a lot of people. What happened with Justin Bieber at Coachella? I'm not interested in doing a full recap of Justin Bieber's life here. I'm not trying to make the typical video of, this was his career, these were his hits, these were his scandals, this was his rise, and this was his fall. Because honestly, that's not the point. The point isn't to list facts. The point is to understand what it means for someone so loaded with history, projection, public judgment, nostalgia, memes, tenderness, exhaustion, and overexposure to do something that, for a lot of people, felt like a gesture of peace. Not perfection, not full redemption, not, look, I've figured everything out and now I'm back flawless, but peace. And that's very different. Because one thing is breaking down in public, and something very different is returning to that same public space. The one that consumed you, projected onto you, idealized you, and then tore you apart. To make peace with your own story in front of everyone. Not just in front of your fans, but in front of the entire archive, in front of the internet, in front of collective memory. In front of the version of you the world thought it knew when you were barely a child. And I think that's why this moment hit so hard. Because it wasn't just nostalgia. Yes, of course there was nostalgia. Obviously there was. We're talking about songs that, for a lot of people, aren't just songs. They're timestamps. They take you back to a very specific era of the internet, of adolescence, of pop culture, of collective sensitivity. Songs that don't just play, they open something. But reducing what happened to people just got carried away by nostalgia feels way too basic. Because nostalgia alone doesn't explain the lump in your throat. It doesn't explain the tears. It doesn't explain that strange feeling of witnessing something beautiful, but beautiful in a slightly unsettling, intimate, almost vulnerable way. Even if you're watching it at a massive festival through a screen. What I think touched something deeper was something else entirely. The feeling of watching someone look at themselves through their own public archive, and instead of running from it, instead of glossing over it, instead of pretending it never existed, actually use it, integrate it, look at it without that layer of cynicism. Without that need to prove they've outgrown their past self. Almost like saying, yes, that was me too. That kid, that haircut, that voice, those songs, that era that was so intensely ridiculed, turned into a meme. looked back on with condescension. All of that is also me. I'm not going to erase it. I'm not going to hide it. I'm not going to pretend I'm above it now. I'm going to sing with it. I'm going to stand here and let my past self and my present self coexist. And even if that sounds simple, it really isn't. Because pop culture is cruel to its child prodigies, but not just to them. It's cruel in general to anyone who grows up in front of us. We love watching someone rise, but we struggle to stay with them through real change. We want the fantasy. We want the projection. We want the version of them that worked for us at a specific moment. And when they change, when they wear down, when they make mistakes, when they look tired, when they stop presenting themselves with the same polish or the same need to please, that's when the judgment kicks in. And in Justin's case, that was amplified by the fact that his story unfolded alongside an internet that was also evolving, becoming faster, harsher, more capable of archiving and recycling humiliation. Justin Bieber wasn't just a successful artist. He was a phenomenon. And being a phenomenon is not the same thing as being famous. A phenomenon becomes a surface for collective projection. It's no longer just about what they sing. It's about what they represent. People project onto them ideas about masculinity, femininity, adolescence, desirability, ridicule, privilege, collapse, fame, fragility, excess. And once you've been turned into that, reclaiming yourself as a person becomes incredibly difficult. Because you're not just coming back from your own mistakes or your own crises. You're coming back from the caricature the world decided to fix in place. That's why I find it so interesting that what moved so many people wasn't a comeback built around, look how intact I am, or look how spectacular I can be. In fact, part of the division online comes from exactly that. Some people watched the moment and felt, this is beautiful, this is human, this is someone making peace with their past. And others watched the same thing and thought, that's it, he just put it on YouTube and sang over it. How basic, how underwhelming, where's the production? And both reactions, even if I don't think they carry the same depth, come from completely different frameworks. One part of the audience was reading meaning. The other was measuring performance. And that difference matters a lot. Because if you approach a moment like this asking how much spectacle there was, how much technical difficulty, how much production, how much novelty, how much visual scale, chances are you'll miss what's actually happening. Not because you're incapable of feeling, but because you're using a different lens. You're treating the moment like a competition of impact, as if the value of a performance depends on how many things happen, how impressive it looks, how much budget you can see on screen, how far it moves away from simplicity. And if that's your main criteria, then yes, an intimate gesture can feel underwhelming. But I think that reveals something bigger about how we consume art now. We've reached a point where a lot of people don't quite know what to do with vulnerability when it isn't packaged as spectacle. If someone cries inside a perfectly lit ballad with flawless camera work, a powerful vocal, and a dramatic orchestral build, we understand it. We know where to place the emotion because it's presented in a language we recognize as important. But if someone shows up in a way that's more stripped down, more ambiguous, less contained, then the instinct is to reduce it, to say, anyone could do that. That takes no skill. That wasn't even a show. And that's where I think we miss something crucial. No, not everyone can do that. Anyone could play a track. Anyone could project old footage. Anyone could lean into nostalgia. But not everyone has that archive. Not everyone has that level of accumulated exposure. Not everyone has that kind of relationship with their younger self. Not everyone can hold, in the same space, the child who became a global phenomenon, the teenager who got ridiculed, the young adult who collapsed under public pressure, and the person who comes back not to erase any of it, but to touch it differently. That's not anyone. That's biography turned into language. And I think another reason this hits so hard is that it didn't feel like a moment of total control. We tend to imagine healing as arriving at a place of perfect calm, clear messaging, clean closure. But in real life, making peace rarely looks like that. Sometimes it looks like being able to hold what used to overwhelm you, to get close without collapsing, to remember without disconnecting from what happened, to even play with your own archive, your own memes, your past versions, without feeling like they destroy you. And there's something deeply human about watching that unfold, because it didn't feel like none of this affects me anymore. It felt more like this affected me deeply. It went through me completely, but I no longer need to fight it in order to exist in front of you. And that's powerful, especially in a time where the internet has trained us to relate to our own image in almost impossible ways. Everything is archived, everything is commented on, everything can be taken out of context, edited, memed, ridiculed, or brought back years later. Most of us, thankfully, don't experience that at the scale of a global celebrity. But we do know, even on a smaller level, what it feels like to be embarrassed by a past version of ourselves, to look at old photos, old texts, old tastes, old ways of speaking, dressing, feeling, and want to distance ourselves, to say, that's not me, that's cringe, that's embarrassing, what was I thinking? So when a public figure does something that says the opposite, something like, no, that was me too, even if I look different now, even if I have a different energy, a different voice, a different story, a different set of scars, that was still me, and I don't need to humiliate that version in order to validate who I've become, that resonates beyond fandom. It resonates on a human level. And to me, that's one of the reasons this reached people who weren't even hardcore fans. You didn't need to be a believer to understand the gesture. You needed to have lived. You needed to know what it's like to look back and see versions of yourself that feel both tender and embarrassing. You needed to know what it's like to wish you could have protected your younger self better. You needed to have felt that strange mix of grief, affection, discomfort, and gratitude toward your own past. I also think the festival context mattered. Not to diminish the moment, but to understand why it landed the way it did. Coachella isn't a single artist concert. It's not a tour built entirely around one person. It's not a stadium full of people who all pay to see one specific act. It's a festival, with multiple stages, different flows of people, mixed audiences, curiosity, movement, people who come for one thing and end up witnessing another. And because of that, a moment like this can feel even more striking. It doesn't appear inside a structure designed to glorify the artist, but in a more open, chaotic, collective space, where something intimate stands out by contrast. If this had been a stadium show built entirely around Justin, the reading would probably have been different. Not necessarily less emotional, but different. The expectation of spectacle, production, pacing, and delivering a full-scale show would have been much higher. In that context, a segment like this could have been beautiful, but it would likely need to coexist with larger, more visually expansive moments. At Coachella, it could be this. It could be almost like an emotional crack in the middle of the festival noise. And that's part of why it hit so hard. I'm also really interested in the online division, not as proof that the moment failed, but as proof of something deeper, that we are very fragmented in how we define value. For some people, value still lives in visible skill, virtuosity, scale, spectacle. For others, value appears somewhere else, in symbolic coherence, emotional weight, the risk of showing up from a more exposed place, the ability to reframe your own archive without erasing it. And I'm not saying one side is purely emotional and the other is shallow. I don't want to fall into something as basic as people who didn't get it are cold. No. Some people simply don't have the emotional or cultural context with Justin for this to land the same way. And that's valid. Sometimes something doesn't move you because it's not your story, not your generation, not your sensitivity, not your archive. But there's a big difference between not connecting and reducing it to anyone could do that. One thing is saying, this didn't move me. Another is denying that there's something meaningful happening. And yes, I also think part of the discomfort comes from the fact that moments like this force us to see artists as people again, after we've consumed them as characters. That confronts us with our own role as an audience. It reminds us that behind the meme, behind the phenomenon, behind the ridiculed era, behind the breakdowns and the headlines, there was someone growing up in real time under disproportionate scrutiny. And we don't always like looking at that directly. It's easier to stay in the joke, in the quick comment, in the expectation that the artist should entertain, impress, compensate, deliver. Vulnerability disrupts that distance. That's why it felt so significant that, for a lot of people, this didn't come across as a request for sympathy, but almost as a kind of embrace. And that distinction matters. It didn't feel like, look at me, poor me, everything I went through. It felt more like, yes, there was a lot. There was noise, there were wounds, there was extreme exposure, there were mistakes, there was a heavy history. But here I am, able to touch all of that without hiding it completely, and without letting it define me entirely. And that has a very particular kind of beauty. Not the beauty of perfection, but the beauty of integration. And maybe that's why it moved so many people. Because what moves us most isn't always watching someone succeed flawlessly, but watching them relate with more softness, or at least less violence, to parts of themselves that used to be sources of pain, ridicule, or distance. There's something powerful about watching someone not just survive their archive, but return to it and reorganize its meaning. And I think that's what people felt. Not, look, he sang old songs. Not, how nostalgic. But look at what it means to return to your past without treating it like an enemy. At the same time, making peace with your past doesn't mean reactivating every part of it in the same way. And you can see that in what wasn't there, in the absences, in the tone choices. Integration isn't about recreating every ritual exactly as it was. Sometimes maturity is about deciding which parts still belong in your present narrative, and which ones remain tied to a context that no longer translates the same way. And that's another reason this feels layered. It's not a literal repetition. It's not dressing up as your former self. It's not automatic fan service. It's curation. It's selection. It's saying, out of everything I was, everything I represented, everything you projected onto me, this is what I can touch today. This is what I can sing. This is what I can look at without betraying myself or completely betraying who I used to be. That, to me, carries far more weight than simple nostalgia. And maybe that's why so many people experienced it as a historic moment, even if that word is always subjective and depends on where you're standing emotionally, generationally, culturally. Was it historically significant in a universal, measurable way? That's always up for debate. But I do think it was historically meaningful in another sense, one that sometimes matters more. It captured something very specific about the time we're living in, and how we relate to public figures, cultural memory, and our own need for reconciliation. Because in the end, maybe what people saw on that stage wasn't just Justin Bieber singing with his archive. Maybe they saw something closer, something more recognizable. The possibility of returning to a version of yourself that was exposed, judged, misunderstood, or even turned into a joke. And instead of burying it, sitting next to it. Not to say everything was fine, not to pretend it didn't hurt, not to force the past into something beautiful, but to do something harder, to stop fighting it. And in a culture that constantly pushes us to edit ourselves, to reinvent ourselves, to distance ourselves with irony from who we were 5 minutes ago, witnessing an act of integration that public, that imperfect, that full of history can feel big. Not because it's loud, but because in the middle of so much noise, it felt human. If there's one thing I want to stay with you after watching this video, it's this. Making peace with your past doesn't mean romanticizing it. It doesn't mean saying everything was okay. And it definitely doesn't mean pretending it didn't hurt. It means something much harder. It means stopping the fight with parts of yourself that existed, even if they make you uncomfortable now. Even if you look at them with a mix of tenderness and embarrassment. And in a culture that constantly pushes us to rewrite ourselves, to distance ourselves with irony from who we were just moments ago, maybe the real act of rebellion isn't reinventing yourself again, but integrating yourself. Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever had to make peace with a version of yourself you'd rather erase? Tell me in the comments, because I think that's where these conversations become real. When we stop talking only about artists and start recognizing ourselves in what we're seeing. If you're into these kinds of conversations, not just about pop culture, but about what's underneath it, this is your space. This is Conscious Conversations. If you liked this video, it would really help me if you leave a like. It's free, and it helps this kind of content reach more people. And if you want to keep exploring these ideas with me, subscribe. See you in the next video.